Let the Dog Drive, an antic noir comedy about a dysfunctional family, interspersed literary and pop cultural references with arresting sex and violence. It gained rave reviews in both the Times Book Review and the New Yorker, despite featuring nothing more in the way of jacket blurbs than an excerpt from a letter to Bowman from Joan Didion, thanking him for mentioning her in the novel. That he'd written to Didion was, I'd learned, typical of Bowman's ingenuous approach to celebrities, literary and otherwise, who fascinated him. More on this soon. During Bowman's 1995 book tour for the Penguin paperback of Let the Dog Drive, he visited Diesel Books in Oakland, California. I was one of a handful who attended. I asked him to autograph my copy of the NYU hardcover and gave him a copy of my then-fresh first novel, Gun with Occasional Music. Bowman inscribed my copy, quote, "To Jonathan, 6 figures in your future." Bowman candidly dreamed of glory for both of us, from the inception of our friendship. Yet it was our dual marginality that created the bond. From this point, I'm implicated in every story I have to tell you about David Bowman. I'm incapable of introducing him without committing memoir. 2. The Bowman Tapes. Bowman returned to New York, and I stayed, for the moment, in my garret in Berkeley. Almost immediately, we'd talk on the phone nearly every day. Bowman was my first conduit to the contemporary literary New York City of the late 90s, which I was now working my courage up to enter, and which was almost wholly mysterious to me. Growing up in Brooklyn hadn't constituted any form of preliminary encounter. Bowman was marvelously charismatic on the phone. His tone amused and conspiratorial, he began every call in media res, with the word, "So." Then he'd leap in midstream, resuming some trailing thought from an earlier conversation, even if it was only one he'd been having with himself. Yet the phone wasn't enough. Bowman besieged me with charmingly nutty, handwritten letters, many of them containing scissor and glue pot collages, usually incorporating elements from the New York tabloids. Page 6 squibs concerning the kinds of writers who generated Page 6 squibs, Mailer, McInerney, his beloved Didion, or downtown figures who'd risen to stardom like Patti Smith, Jim Jarmusch, David Byrne, combined with Bowman's own cartoonish Sharpie scribbles or his personal erotic photography. He'd call these cut-ups charms. They were meant to convey writerly luck. One I still have tacked up over my desk was called the, quote, Dancing DeLillo's charm, a row of roquettes with Don DeLillo's head atop each dancer. Yet there's more. The Bowman Tapes. He and his wife regularly rented a cabin in Montauk, and while there he'd pace the beach, drinking beer and monologuing to me into a tape recorder. The cassettes arrived in the mail, incoherently labeled. I'd pop them into my car or home tape player and listen. They were hypnotic, outlandish, and boring at once. Bowman's monologues were elaborately themed, usually some variation on his obsession with writerly ambition and how it was cursed for him, for me, and nearly anybody, by the afflictions of personal fate. He'd inaugurate each rant with certain key phrases to which he'd return, as if in song. Bowman was a master at a kind of verbal plate-spinning routine, but he was also a helpless digressionist, and sometimes a plate on the far side of the stage would be forgotten for 20 minutes or more. Sometimes you'd have to flip the tape over to find out if he'd forgotten his theme. This is improbable, but much about Bowman is improbable. He sent more tapes than I found time to listen to. I recall my girlfriend complaining about how they'd begun filling up the floor space in the passenger side of my Toyota Corolla. I did my best to keep up, but it was hopeless. On the tapes, Bowman's dreams and schemes were interspersed with the crunch of his feet on the wet Montauk beach at night. And though I haven't listened to one of the Bowman tapes in nearly 2 decades, I can still hear that gravel crunch and the heavy breathing of his pauses for thought, as if it recurs in my nightly dreams. 3. The Lot 49 Method. Bowman's loyalty and generosity were simply immense in those first years, while I remained stranded in Berkeley, far from the action,